welcome. I'm Baxter with a summary of BBC World News. And at least 15,000 people in Syria have gathered at the Turkish border after heavy fighting near the city of Aleppo. So far, they're not being allowed to cross the frontier, but Turkish aid workers have gone into Syrian territory to give them assistance. The Turkish Prime Minister says he believes tens of thousands more refugees may be on their way. Well, they're said to be heading towards the Turkish city of Kilis. Aleppo is a mere 60 kilometres from Turkey. Well, earlier our correspondent Celine Giddit told us that the crossing on the Turkish side remains closed.
All we saw was only 8 trucks going in and a few ambulances, and that was it. We didn't see any Syrian on the other side of the border. There's a buffer zone, a no man's land, as we might call it, between the two border crossings. So the thousands of Syrians waiting at the Syrian side of the border were not we couldn't see them ourselves. Well, there reportedly, the UN says there are 15,000 people waiting at the border, on the Syrian side of the border, and Turkish government says there are plenty more, thousands, tens of thousands more on the way from Aleppo to Kilis, to Turkey, trying to make their way into Turkey. Today, we haven't seen anyone coming in, but the Prime Minister has said Turkey is ready to give food and shelter, will not leave Syrians without food and shelter, but he didn't specify whether the Turkish government is prepared to take these new refugees in.
Let's bring you some other news now, because scientists in Brazil say that the Zika virus has been found in human saliva and urine. The finding, made by a medical research institute affiliated with the Brazilian government, raises significant questions about how the virus might be transmitted. The founder of the WikiLeaks website, Julian Assange, has been speaking from the balcony of the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He said the finding of a UN human rights panel that he has been arbitrarily detained by Britain and Sweden means that he must be allowed to walk free. And Britain's proposed EU reforms have been strongly backed by the Danish Prime Minister. The British Prime Minister David Cameron's been in Copenhagen trying to gain support in advance of a referendum. He also held positive talks in Poland, but the Prime Minister there said plans to limit benefits for EU migrants would need further discussion. And that's the news this hour here on BBC World News.
Now it's time for Business Live with me, Michelle Fleury, in New York. Our top story today: job creation in the US slows down, but finally wages are going up.
And I'm Baxter, live in London. And the poor jobs data renews concerns about a Federal Reserve rate hike. As more countries use electronic voting machines and biometrics for their elections, we examine the pros and cons of switching on or off.
And at an estimated $5 million per 30 seconds, advertisers go all in for the Super Bowl.
And we'll bring you up to date with all the latest news from the markets, where stocks are solidly lower on Friday after that report showed that US jobs creation slowed last month. Very warm welcome to the programme. Now, more bad news today for the recovery of the US economy. Last week, figures indicated that growth slowed, and now this new data indicates that US job creation has also slowed down. Well, the Bureau of Labour Statistics reported that America added just 151,000 jobs in January, but that did help to push the country's unemployment rate down to 4.9%, an 8-year low. The number was lower than expected and is a sharp slowdown from December, when almost 300,000 jobs were added. Jobs were lost in transport and education, but gained in retail, healthcare and manufacturing. Last week, economic growth inside the US also slowed, and investors are concerned that today's numbers could be a further signal of a weakening US economy. But weaker job numbers also means another rise in interest rates is unlikely for now. Well, on that final thought, Michelle, the possible implications of these numbers for interest rates in America, some analysts are saying that they're surprised by the negative reaction that they sparked on markets straight away.
Well, and you're right, because it wasn't all negative. If you look at the net job creation, that actually was enough to push the unemployment rate below 5%. That's where it's been for the last 3 months, and it's also pushed it to its lowest level since early 2008. Also, another positive bit from this report is that average hourly wages actually rose by 12 cents, or half a percentage point. That's something economists have been waiting for.
Yeah, indeed. So actually more nuance when you look into it, the result of that. So I suppose the jury really is still out as to whether this data supports the pro or anti-rate hikers, and also whether or not the Fed was too quick to tighten monetary policy back in December.
Well, these are all questions for my guest, Diane Swonk. She is one of the most recognisable faces in economic forecasting, and she joins me now from Chicago. Diane, if I could start, is this a good or a bad report? You've got slowing jobs growth, but you've got the unemployment rate down and wage growth up.
Well, I actually think it's a pretty good report coming off a very strong month where we know unseasonably warm winter weather helped boost the numbers in December. We had some give back, a slowdown in construction activity, and the retailers who had said, listen, we're not seeing people come on in the bricks, our brick and mortar stores, and people are using their clicks and going online instead. We thought we would see more layoffs in the retail sector, and in fact we didn't. We also saw those strong gains in leisure and hospitality. That's some of that oil dividend that people keep saying we don't see out there. We are actually seeing it in lower and middle income households. And as you correctly pointed out, not only did the unemployment rate came down, it came down for a good reason. It came down with labor force participation rate up and wages stayed buoyant. In fact, we're now finally getting a little bit of traction in wage growth.
So if you're gaining a bit of traction when it comes to people's paychecks essentially going up, and there's a sense that the consumer is feeling stronger, and yet if you look at food stamps, for example, 1 in 7 Americans are still collecting food stamps.
Well, it really gets to the ongoing idea that I think you see coming out of the Fed is that, yes, they want to raise rates, but they don't want to raise them so rapidly to snuff out growth. And the Fed has been very consistent about looking to overshoot on the downside on unemployment. They welcome lower than what they think is the full unemployment rate to re-engage those workers who have been sidelined. They still worry about the numbers of people who are accepting part-time instead of full-time work, and that high and elevated still U6, the more overall unemployment rate number that measures more of the misery index for the U.S. economy. So we're coming out of it, but remember, we're maybe at a jog. We're not at a full run yet.
So for people coming into this report, they've been looking at manufacturing. There's been talk about whether or not the U.S. was ready to go into a downturn. Now you've got this sort of mixed or nuanced job report. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave the Fed?
Well, I think what you see is Main Street really is ready to pick up the baton from Wall Street, which has been battered fairly badly over the last several months. And that is good news for the overall U.S. economy. I think March is still on the table, but my bet is on June for the first rate hike, another rate hike by the Fed, and not another one until December. I think this is still going to be much slower than the Fed itself expects. They've been notoriously overly optimistic about their ability to get the economy stronger with more inflation.
Diane Swonk in Chicago, thank you. Always great to speak to you.
Good to see you.
Interesting stuff. Let's check out some other news from around the globe this hour. And scientists in the UK say that a devastating bee disease is being spread around the world by imports and exports of commercial honeybees. They say the virus, acting alongside the parasitic varroa has already killed off millions of colonies of bees. Lawyers for the alleged flash crash trader Navinder Sarro have argued that he should not be extradited to the United States because the offences that he's accused of were not crimes in the UK. US authorities allege that Mr. Sarro is guilty of manipulating the markets, allowing him to buy or sell at a profit. And ArcelorMittal, one of the world's largest producers of iron ore and coal, has slumped to an annual loss of almost $8 billion. The world's biggest steelmaker was hit by plunging commodity prices. Well, Wall Street was sharply lower on Friday after that January jobs report showed that US unemployment hit an 8-year low and also appeared to revive the debate of a potential Fed rate hike later this year. Well, adding to the negative sentiment, technology stocks, they sold off heavily following weak forecasts from LinkedIn and also from Tableau software, and big names such as Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft. They were all among the biggest drags on both the Nasdaq and also on the S&P 500. Meanwhile, here in Europe, shares in London and in Frankfurt and in Paris, they all dipped immediately after the release of the jobs data, after rising earlier in the session, before then later stabilising somewhat. Well, Germany's DAX, that led Europe's main bourses into negative territory, closing more than 1% down. It was then followed by the FTSE here in London and also France's CAC. Time now for Michelle and I to take a look at what's been breaking and trending on our websites and social media.
And Alice, there's been a lot of noise lately about GoPro's plunging prospects. Yeah. I don't know if you own one of these wearable cameras, but the company that makes them, its share price is, well, it's up today, but it's actually been in a tailspin lately. In fact, down 40% over the last month.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons, Michelle, given for the sell-off, beautifully encapsulated in this tweet from the Wall Street Journal, saying GoPro reports a surprising loss and projects declining sales in 2016. So more to come.
John Rivers Minton has been actually following GoPro's share price, and he asks on Facebook, why is GoPro price sucking so bad? Don't know if I'd put it like that, but anyway, he says, is anyone unhappy, I should say, with their GoPro? Does customer service suck? Is there a better alternative, or was the stock just overvalued at the get-go?
Well, Vanity Fair, Michelle, they've got an answer on this. They offer up this. Is the party over for GoPro and for Fitbit? How many marathons can you run with a camera strapped to your chest? It's a fair point, isn't it?
Well, I guess if you're a marathon runner, maybe quite a few. But the party does seem to be over for the company's founder, because as Bloomberg notes, GoPro founder is now a former billionaire, as fortune falls to $770 million on stock plunge. Not that I feel too sorry for him with $770 million. Anyway, remember, we do like to hear your views, so get in touch using the hashtag BBC Biz Live.
Absolutely right. And now for just one more story. A 1957 Ferrari sports car has been sold in Paris for 28 million euros, or just over 32 million if you count the auctioneer's fees. That's a new record for a car priced in euros. So what's so special about it? Theo Leggett explains.
There's tension and euphoria in the air, and the hammer goes down.
28 millions!
This Ferrari has just become the most expensive car ever sold at auction, in euros at least. So what will the buyer get for his money? Much more than just a collection of shiny glass and metal. This car has history.
Ferrari. Also in the Ferrari team is Britain's Peter Collins.
It's a Ferrari 335 Scaglietti, one of only a handful ever made. It competed in a golden age of motor racing at events like the Le Mans 24 Hours and the Mille Miglia Marathon across Italy. It was driven by some of the great drivers of the era, among them Stirling Moss and Wolfgang von Trips. That makes it unique, and in the world of classic cars, rarity really matters. Theo Leggett, BBC News.
Beautiful. Still to come, we look at the future technology for elections, which came about after the Florida voting debacle of 2000.
And from New York, it's Super Bowl, the moment that America comes to a standstill, and therefore one of the biggest TV advertising moments of the year. We look at the numbers.
This is the moment that millions in Iran have been waiting for. After his long years in exile, the first hesitant steps of Ayatollah Khomeini on Iranian soil.
South Africa's white government has offered its black opponents concessions unparalleled in the history of apartheid. The ban on the African National Congress is lifted immediately, and the ANC leader Nelson Mandela, after 27 years in jail, is to be set free unconditionally.
The aircraft was returning from Belgrade, where Manchester United had entered the semi-final of the European Cup.
Two Americans have become the first humans to walk in space without any lifeline to their spaceship. One of them called it a piece of cake.
Thousands of people have given the yachtswoman Ellen MacArthur a spectacular homecoming in the Cornish port of Falmouth after she smashed the world record for sailing solo around the world non-stop.
Very warm welcome back to Business Live with me, Alice Baxter, live in London, where our top story is the US economy, where job growth slows but wages go up.
Well, something that will be impossible to miss this weekend, in the US at least, is the Super Bowl. The game between the Carolina Panthers and the Denver Broncos isn't just America's football's biggest day of the year, it's also one of the advertising industry's biggest moments as well. Last year, nearly $350 million was spent on a little over 45 minutes of TV advertising in the game. Now, that amount is still increasing each year. It's 53% more than 10 years ago. And it means that each 30-second TV ad costs something like $4.4 million. Well, earlier, I spoke to the editorial director of Adweek, James Cooper, and asked why advertisers are willing to stake so much on the Super Bowl.
Well, the expense of it is huge. This year, it's approaching $5 million per 30-second spot. That's certainly a record. But you also have to remember that this is the biggest media event globally of the year. I mean, 115 million people will watch the telecast probably on Sunday. You cannot get an audience that big anywhere these days. And sure, you could experiment with digital, but you can only do it in pieces. And it's very hard to cobble together a massive reach audience, like 115 million people. So that's why these brands who are selling cars and beer and soda and want to sell you movie tickets want to be in the Super Bowl, because they can reach this mass audience very quickly. It's expensive, but if your creative works well and it's well received, it can have a real brand lift.
Given it's so expensive, how do brands try to get the most value for their money, and how does it dovetail with their digital strategy?
Right, so YouTube has become a massive player in the Super Bowl. They use YouTube to either release their ad in full before the game to build awareness and buzz. More recently, they've been a little bit more clever, I think, in tease ads. So they build a social media sort of following of these ads in anticipation that leads up, to the actual air date on Sunday. So they want to stretch that $5 million investment, and they can use social media to do it before, during, and after the game.
Given how expensive Super Bowl ads are, I mean, how much of a company's annual marketing budget will go towards an event, a TV ad like this?
Right. Well, you have the giants like Budweiser. They bought 3 minutes of time. I mean, for them, it's a huge company. Still a lot of money, but it's not going to really put a dent in their marketing budget. But then you've got these new players, these small players. Like there's a company like SoFi, which is a financial services marketing company. They spent fully 20% of their annual advertising budget on this $5 million ad in the Super Bowl. Massive gamble for those guys, because if the ad doesn't really do anything for them, they're 20% down for their marketing spend. But there have been great instances of people who have taken that flyer. Masterlock back, I think, in the 70s, no one really had heard of Masterlock, the U.S. lock company, and they spent whatever it cost back then to do a Super Bowl ad, and they created this iconic ad of someone shooting a bullet through the lock and the lock still staying locked. It made their company. So it can be. If you're willing to make that gamble and your creative is good and you're a young company, it can really be a game changer.
Now, let's get behind the headlines, because when you think how much we rely on technology in our everyday lives, it seems pretty amazing that most of the world still uses a pen and paper to vote for their governments and politicians. But that's changing, and the number who are using electronic voting machines is growing. Currently, only Belgium, Brazil, India and Venezuela use an electronic voting system. The US, which of course is holding its election later this year, and other countries do use them in some areas, but not nationally. Well, the Venezuelan elections last December authenticated voters biometrically before voting electronically, and the polling turnout hit 74.25% of the population. And last week, Bulgaria also gave the green light to introduce the system in the next year. Well, although many are concerned an electronic system would be open to fraud and corruption, advocates for the tech vote claim it's the safest way of casting a vote. Let's take a closer look now at this with the CEO and founder of Smartmatic, Antonio Mugica, who joins me here in the studio. Many thanks for joining me. Now, you claim that electronic voting is faster, it's cheaper, it empowers poorer voters, that it even saves lives. These are big claims. How do you support them?
Well, I think something important is that we have been doing this for the past 12 years, and we have had significant experience across the world. 3.5 billion votes counted and cast with our systems, and that track record and talking to 40 different countries is what allows us to say, look how we save lives here, look how people were empowered here, look how integrity of the election process was increased, turnout was increased, all these benefits just pile on and on.
But there are still concerns that surround electronic voting. Both the Netherlands and Ireland have turned their back on it after a couple of disastrous experiments. In Holland, their system was hacked. In Ireland, they lost a huge amount of money after their machines were proven not to be reliable. I know that your technology was not involved in either of those instances. Right. But you've been quoted as saying that your machines and software are foolproof, they're tamper-proof, they're hacker-proof. How can you be so sure?
Well, I think something very important that we need to take into account first is that the easiest election to hack is a paper-based election. And a well-implemented automated system or electronic voting system actually increases integrity and security very, very much.
But what about the issues of cybersecurity?
Well, actually, we can get a little bit too technical, but let me put it in these ways. A big benefit that you have as a technologist when you're creating a voting system is that a voting system only works for one day, election day. And protecting a system for one day is actually, I would say, extremely easy compared to protecting a system that's always on, like a bank or like NASA or like a government agency, which is always on 365 days, 24/7 for years and years. It's like protecting a house for one day or protecting it forever. It's a lot harder to protect it forever.
So you argue that taking human intervention as far as possible out of the voting system is actually safer. Can you just explain briefly, if you can, the difference between your system and optical scanners, which are currently used in parts of the US, but which you maintain still have quite a large margin of error?
No, actually, I mean, optical scanners, when well implemented, are a significant improvement over paper-based voting, and we do design and sell optical scanners as well. Now, electronic voting has one inherent advantage over optical scanner, which is voter intent is 100% accurate, whereas in an optical scanner, if a voter makes a mistake and, let's say, marks two candidates for the same pose, then the scanner will not know what to do, just like a person will not know what to do, right? So voter intent is not perfect with optical scanners, whereas voter intent can always be perfectly determined with electronic voting.
Very, very briefly, is voting online, as in Estonia, is that the next step?
Well, definitely. Online voting is happening already. It's happening across the private sector. Estonia is the biggest online voting that's actually using it for government elections successfully. We work with them, and we are seeing this happening basically all across the world.
Many, many thanks, Antonio Mugica from Smartmatic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, very much.
Well, there are lots of ways to stay in touch with BBC Business, and here's a reminder of how to get in touch.
The Business Live webpage is where you can stay ahead with all the day's breaking business news. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest details with insight and analysis from the BBC's team of editors right around the world. And we want to hear from you too. Get involved on the BBC Business Live webpage at bbc.com/business. On Twitter, we're at BBC Business, and you can find us on Facebook at BBC Business News. Business Live, on TV and online, whenever you need to know.
Quick look at papers now, and beginning with the FT. Michelle, Toyota, the world's biggest car group, suffering its first fall in quarterly operating profit since early 2014.
Well, and what's interesting, Alice, is that it released its results early this Friday. While US sales actually are pretty robust, Toyota suffered from, I guess, the growing pressure on all car makers, which is to invest heavily in new technologies like fuel cell vehicles and, of course, you know, artificial intelligence.
And also it's suffering from what all of those Japanese car makers are, you know, the increase to raise wages there as well, a real turnaround from last year.
Well, Alice, there was another story that caught my eye. This one was actually about football. It has to do with a pricing of a star who's headed to China, I believe.
I know, absolutely right. $56 million, Michelle. The exact amount depends on what publication you're reading, but according to the China Daily, you're absolutely right. That's what mega-rich Super League club Jiangsu Sunsung's paid for Brazilian forward Alex Teixeira. Huge sums.
And I think you said here, you told me he's only just turned 26.
Oh,
anyway, unfortunately, we are, I know, so young. We're out of time, I'm afraid, but we will be back next week with all the latest business headlines and football news. But for now, goodbye.
And goodbye from me in London. More Business Live next week.